Good afternoon, y'all. You're awake. That's a good sign after lunch. Well, I'm Gary Rush. I'm going to be down here talking. They asked me to talk because I did a newsletter a little while ago talking about the history and future of facilitators. And I guess because when you get to become an old fart, experienced in the industry, you get a chance to talk about the history. And I've seen a bit of history. I began as a facilitator in 1983. So I've been facilitating for 29 years, although in 1983 we didn't call it facilitation. That time I was called a session leader or process leader, and I was facilitating all these things called JAD workshops, Joint Application Design. I thought, well, that's the world of facilitation. That's all there is, right? Well, we also found out that the ICA and some other people were facilitating like crazy, but in 1983 and in the early 80s, most facilitation was really done with community groups. It was done with a lot of NGOs, largely non-corporate environments, because most corporations looked at facilitators as, well, we can avoid them if possible. And I remember going into corporations trying to explain to people, this is what I do, and they go, you're kidding, right? And I remember my father introduced me to a bunch of corporate executives one time. He says, this is my son, he's successful, and I think what he does is legal. Thank you, Dad. So people had a real misconception of what facilitation was all about in the 80s. In fact, if you ever watched Hollywood movies in the 80s, and even today, word facilitator, it's a synonym for a hitman from Chicago. Which worked for me, because I'm from Chicago, so I'd come in with a gun and it worked out really well. Probably not the image we really want to portray to people. So facilitator was really unknown. In fact, the word was not even used for what we do until 1985. Terry Bergdahl from ICA wrote a manual and decided to call us facilitators, which was good and bad. That meant that nobody had a clue what we did, but now we had a name for it. So the 80s were really tough trying to get people to understand there were very few people out there training, probably fewer than a dozen people training or a dozen groups training facilitators anywhere in the world, which made it real easy to break in the business because there weren't that many out there. Now, near the end of the 80s, some things started to change. I remember in 1989, the General Services Administration for the federal government decided, you know, this facilitation stuff's pretty good. We really ought to make people do this. So they had a program for their project managers. They called it the Trail Boss program. And they ran all their senior project managers through this. And one of their documents said, if you're going to run a project, you need to use facilitation. You need to run these workshops. So they brought me in to explain what that meant, because they're going, what? So we explained it to them, and it worked out pretty well. Now, the 90s saw a big change. The 90s, facilitation started to grow. And that's where in 94, when the IAF was formed, and 95, the first conference was, we started to actually get some energy around us. We had some people who knew what we were, the other facilitators. You know, we could group together and commiserate about the fact that we were the only people who understood what we did and why we did it. We kept going with the IAF. In 98, suddenly the Certified Professional Facilitator program was created. Now we have a designation. We've got people saying, now we know the difference between a good facilitator and someone who's still learning, all right? So now we've got the certification. And near the end of the 90s, you also saw a lot of facilitation departments forming. I saw organizations where facilitators were coming together. Companies would set up, they'd have a dozen or 15 people that their sole job was to facilitate. And it was great. We did an awful lot of that. And now, instead of fewer than a dozen people training around the world, we had hundreds of people out there training. Great, more competition. But it was good because we were really growing and pushing the facilitation thing. Then 2000s hit. Now, I'll never forget, I was in Portland at a conference, and Sam Canner got up there, and he said, he started the session. There were about 250 people in the room, and Sam got up there and he said, all right, how many of you people here would have called yourself a facilitator prior to 1980? 5 people raised their hands, slowly. He said, all right, how many people would have called yourself facilitators prior to 1990? About 15 of us raised our hands. He said, how many people would call yourself facilitators since 2000? 175 people raised their hands. A lot of growth. But some things changed. We were pushing, when we still are, pushing, trying to get people to understand that facilitation is a cool thing. You heard Duncan yesterday say, this has got to be the pivotal profession of the 21st century. And he's absolutely right, it is. It's going to change the world in a big way. The trouble is, I think we're getting what we asked for in a different way than what we asked for it. All right? Because what I've seen in the 2000s is we're not growing those departments of facilitation. They're disappearing. And the reason for that is everybody else is learning how to facilitate. It's become a core competency of project managers, business analysts, HR professionals, and umpteen other careers. Now, you can't do that job unless you have facilitation skills. So what do we do with all these people who are dedicated facilitators? Well, I think there's still going to be a need for people who do nothing but facilitation, because a lot of organizations need us to come in to help in areas where the internal facilitators cannot help them in different areas. And we can span a lot of different things. There are other groups that don't have the ability to have facilitators. But I think we're going to see that over the next few years, we're not going to see a couple thousand facilitators. We're going to see millions of facilitators. But they're not going to call themselves facilitators. They're going to use facilitation skills in everything they do. And that has a huge implication for us in a lot of ways. First of all, I think the organization is going to have to start to recognize that this thing that they mistakenly call soft skills, which makes me nuts. I've never found it soft dealing with people. It's pretty damn hard sometimes. Why don't we call them? They're people skills. It's understanding how to deal with people. And I tell my students every time, the skills you learn as a facilitator, this is the only skill set that cannot be outsourced, period. I can outsource HR, accounting, every technical thing. We could outsource the entire corporation, but we cannot outsource the ability to get a bunch of people to come together and do good work. And that's what facilitators do, all right? Facilitators are the leaders of the future, because that's what leaders do. Only we do it kinder and gentler, in a nicer way. So it's got some implications for the organizations. They're going to have to figure out, how do we deal with these people, all right? It's got implications for the trainers, because we got to realize, I'm not training people to facilitate as a full-time job. This is not what they do. This is part of what they do. So I got to figure out how to incorporate that into their job so that they develop these skills and use it in what they do. And I also put it to you folks, and I put it to the association a number of times before, and I've been very popular for it. I think we need to change the name of the IAF, or we need to think about it. The International Association of Facilitators is about as big as it's going to get, because how many organizations have job descriptions in HR that says, I need a facilitator? Very few. What they have is job descriptions for people who need facilitation skills. And we've seen an awful lot of people who pick up facilitation skills. If you ever go to ASTD, the American Society of Training and Development, everybody there, they call themselves a facilitator. And we used to get upset about it, but really, they are facilitators. They're learning facilitators. We're group facilitators. And we need to be ahead of the curve and be an international association of facilitation, because that's what we're really, really good at. We know how to get people to collaborate. We know how to do it well, and we know how to train other people to do it. And if we open this up, we could be an enormous organization, but more importantly, we can affect how facilitation goes forward in the future. And if we don't, we're going to be dinosaurs within about 5 to 10 years. This facilitation, whether people recognize it or not, is growing faster than we can keep up with it. So it's just a thought to you. Oh, it's just a thought I want to put out to you all. Think about it. We are proponents of facilitation more than proponents of facilitators. Thank you.